A few weeks ago, I had lunch with a friend of mine. He was a Democrat. I told him I was a Republican, and it was a fun meal. When I told him that, he had like 50 different questions, but like, how can you think this, and what do you think about this, and blah blah blah. And I loved having the chance to just sort of like come out and express my own views and get them challenged, and I don't know, just rethink some of my positions. And one question he had for me that I was honestly unprepared for was what I thought about RFK Jr. as a potential pick for the Secretary, what was it, like Secretary of Health and Human Services, I think. I mean, he definitely did not like RFK Jr. and was telling me certain things about him and saying, well, how do you feel about this? And I just said, look, I'm going to have to go back and do more research because I've heard of him. I know that he's sort of known for conspiracy theories, but I don't really know enough about him to give an opinion on this. And let me tell you, if you want to try all this stuff for yourself of actually like going down the rabbit hole and looking into misinformation and finding the original context of quotes and separating out what's true from what's like conjecture, well, I don't want to say conjecture, like sensationalized. RFK Jr. is probably your biggest challenge that you can find. There's definitely a lot of stuff published online about just all the conspiracy theories that he has believed in and claims that he's made. But most of what I've been able to find is other people saying what he said. And it's very hard to find actual quotations from him about what he said on a bunch of different topics. But when you do find them, the quotations typically tend to be a lot more nuanced than the way they've been framed. Like they might be framed as like, oh, RFK believes blah, 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 when really what he said is something along the lines of, I think we should do more research into blah, blah, blah. And I don't know, in my opinion, like a lot of times, if you're looking at something and saying, hey, we should look into this further, a lot of times it's reasonable. Not always, but I mean, that's how science works, right? Like you make a hypothesis, then you design an experiment to test the hypothesis. And then, yeah, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But like if you label a hypothesis untrue before you design an experiment to test if it's true, like how are you going to do science? So anyways, to give a specific example of this, one thing that I read that RFK Jr. was a proponent of was the idea that SSRIs, I forget what SSRI stands for, but it's essentially like antidepressants, that the usage of that could be linked to school shootings. And when I read about this, like the first few places that I found, they just called it like a quote unquote false claim or baseless claim, which, I mean, let's just point out there's a difference between unproven and false. But hey, you know what? Maybe it is false. So I decided to just look into it a little further. First of all, I wanted to see what RFK Jr. actually said about it. And then second of all, I wanted to see what research had been done about it to see to what extent this was false as opposed to unproven. So first of all, when you look into what RFK Jr. said about it, all that I could really find was that like, basically he was like, there's no good studies on this and we should do more research on it. But I don't know, you know what? Maybe there are good studies because if this has been proven false, then maybe there are good studies and it showed no connection. So next I found an actual fact check. I think this was PolitiFact. And the PolitiFact article said 13.2% of adults had taken antidepressants in the last 30 days. And that rate amongst mass shooters wasn't much higher. And then they provided like 3 different studies of like actually looking at what are the rates of using SSRIs at the time or recently among mass shooters. And I read it over. It all checked out. I was about to close out and be like, okay, yeah, RFK Jr. is probably wrong on this one. And then one word jumped out at me. And that one word, 13.2% of adults. How many school shooters are adults? probably, I mean, I don't know the exact number, but probably the minority. And then I actually looked closer at the different studies that they were putting in as they're, you know, like, oh, this is similar. And 2 of those 3 studies were of mass shooters, not specifically school shooters. And the idea, I think the idea that RFK Jr. was getting at was there's been some studies done, maybe like, not, well, I shouldn't say some. I think it was 1 study, and I think it was in like Europe, like Sweden or like somewhere in like Northern Europe. And it was showing that, that SSRIs can have an impact on still developing brains. And so it's, a lot of psychiatrists don't like to prescribe them to minors because of that concern. So the idea that, like, you know, that is linked to school shootings, like the fact that we're separating out children from adults is significant here. So there was 1 study that did actually specify school shooters. But before we get into that, I decided to do some of my own research and see during the same period of time where they were measuring that 13.2% of adults were taking these SSRIs, because I think the study was from like 2015 to 2018 or something. What was the percentage in teenagers? And more specifically, teenage boys, because school shooters tend to be boys. That number was 4.2%. So way, way below the 13.2%. So I decided, okay, let's compare that with the 1 study that they linked to that actually was school shootings. And when I clicked on the school shootings, it was actually kind of nice because they had neatly separated out their data into secondary shooters, college shooters, and I think it was called like aberrant shooters, which I'm guessing is maybe people from like the community that like went into the school, but I'm not sure. Anyways, what I decided to do was focus on the secondary shooters because that would probably be the one that was most likely to have actual teenagers in it, so that we're comparing like against like. So when I looked at that data, the percentage of secondary shooters who had taken SSRIs, either they were taking them at the time or had taken them recently, was 14%. So yes, if you compare that number to adults, that doesn't seem very significant. But when you compare that to the 4.2% number, think about it. That is a big difference. And then the other thing that I do want to mention, and at this point, we're not comparing like against like, but I think it's significant. The percentage of secondary school shooters who had taken SSRIs in the past, so now we're combining like taking them at the time, taking them recently, or taking them in the past but not recently, then that number went up to 30%. And when you think about the idea that there's been some evidence, not a lot, but some evidence that SSRIs can mess with your developing brain, specifically in terms of violence, that they can make you more inclined to self-harm and possibly more inclined to harm others. Even if you had taken the SSRIs more than 30 days ago, if you had taken that while your brain was developing, there's a chance that there could be a link. So basically, this 1 study was the only study I could find that was directly measuring the SSRI usage in school shooters. But this 1 study was showing a very significant difference in rates between school shooters and rates in the general teenage male population. So the end result to me is that RFK Jr. is sounding like the most sane person in the room, because he's not saying SSRIs definitely cause school shootings. I mean, let's be honest, like usually you get on SSRIs because there's something mentally that's not working too well. So you could say, yeah, the same mental illness that's getting you on SSRIs is causing you to do this other stuff. But what RFK Jr. is saying is that it's compelling and more research should be done. I, for one, agree with RFK Jr. This does not sound like a false claim or a baseless claim. This sounds like an incredibly reasonable thing to say.